My name is Elena Mercer, a 32-year-old trauma recovery counselor who learned to measure her worth in silence, because in my family, attention was something you earned by not needing it. My younger brother, Julian, was the golden child Mom protected and Dad showcased, the one they described as our future, even when he failed publicly, while I was corrected, monitored, and quietly rewritten whenever I threatened their version of the truth. Mom excused Julian's debts, mistakes, and disappearances as growing pains. But she called my independence defiance and my survival ungrateful, as if standing on my own without them was a form of betrayal. And when Dad raised his glass at the Mercer Foundation gala and said, smiling for donors and cameras, that I had always been the daughter who was never meant to survive, I felt my hand close around the recorder in my purse before I even realized what I was about to do. The ballroom at the Halston Hotel shimmered with controlled elegance, the kind that softened every sharp edge and turned power into something almost beautiful. But I had learned long ago that nothing in my parents' world was ever as gentle as it looked from a distance. I had arrived early, greeted board members, answered questions about the trauma recovery program I had built from scratch over 4 years, and listened as people casually credited Julian for the work, because he had repeated my language once at a brunch, and my parents had decided that was enough to crown him. He stood near Dad now in a tailored tuxedo, relaxed and confident, while I sat at a table with donors who smiled politely at me, but leaned toward him whenever the conversation shifted to impact, funding, or vision. That was always the arrangement. He represented the story, and I carried the truth. Mom found me before the keynote began, her expression already sharpened into the version she used when she wanted obedience without resistance, and she reminded me in a soft and controlled voice that tonight was important, and that I needed to be careful not to create tension the way I often did when I forgot my place. I asked her what exactly that meant this time, keeping my tone level even as I felt the old pressure building in my chest. And she replied that correcting Julian in front of donors, acting as if the program belonged to me, and bringing personal emotion into professional spaces were all examples of behavior that embarrassed the family. I told her quietly that it did belong to me, that I had written every proposal, secured every early grant, and worked through nights she never saw, and she smiled in that practiced way that erased me without raising her voice. Then she said that none of that mattered if I didn't know how to carry a room. I understood then that nothing I said would change the script they had already decided to perform. The accident came back to me without warning, not as a story but as a sensation. The smell of metal and wet asphalt, the crushing silence after impact, and the distant voice of a paramedic saying I was lucky while my body refused to respond the way it should. I remembered waking in the hospital to hear Dad in the hallway, not asking whether I was alive or in pain, but asking whether the situation could damage the family's reputation if it became public, and I remembered realizing, even then, that survival had never been the part of me they valued. It had been an inconvenience, something that complicated their narrative. The applause pulled me back as Dad stepped onto the stage, confident, composed, perfectly framed beneath the warm light that made everything he said sound intentional and important. And I watched as he moved through his speech with the ease of a man who had spent decades turning control into charisma. He spoke about resilience, about responsibility, about the duty of families to rise above hardship, and the room responded exactly as he expected, leaning in, nodding, believing every word because he had learned how to package truth and distortion into something indistinguishable. Then he shifted, just slightly, into family. That was when the air changed. He praised Mom first, then Julian, describing him as disciplined, visionary, and strong under pressure. And I felt the familiar tightening in my chest as I waited for my name, knowing from experience that when it came, it would not be in the same tone. His eyes moved across the room and settled on me, holding just long enough to make the moment deliberate, and I understood before he spoke that I was about to become the lesson. He said that real resilience meant recognizing differences within your own family, that not every child was meant to carry the same weight, and that sometimes strength revealed itself through survival, while weakness revealed itself through dependence. Then he smiled. And he said it. He said that I had always been the family's tragedy, the daughter who should not have made it through the years that shaped them, the one who was never meant to survive. And for a second, the room hesitated between laughter and discomfort, unsure whether to follow his lead or question what they had just heard. I did not move, did not react the way they expected, because something inside me had shifted from hurt into precision, from emotion into awareness, and I realized that this was no longer just another moment of humiliation I would absorb and carry quietly. This was evidence. I reached into my purse slowly, carefully, feeling the cool edge of the recorder against my fingers. And as the room settled back into applause that sounded thinner than before, I pressed my thumb against the button without looking down. This time I wasn't going to let them rewrite it. The applause that followed felt thinner than it should have, stretched across the room like something rehearsed rather than real. And as Dad stepped away from the microphone with that same polished composure, I could see the first small cracks forming in the audience, subtle glances, tightened smiles, the kind of hesitation that meant not everyone had understood the comment as a harmless anecdote. I kept my posture steady, my expression neutral, because reacting now would only give them the version of me they had trained people to expect. The emotional, unstable daughter who proved their narrative simply by resisting it. Instead, I listened as donors resumed quiet conversations, as glasses clinked again, and as Julian moved toward a group near the stage, already stepping into the space Dad had just cleared for him with that speech. He didn't look at me. He never did when it mattered. Mom reached my table within seconds, her timing precise in the way it always was when damage control needed to happen before perception settled into something harder to shift, and she leaned slightly toward me with a smile that looked warm from a distance but carried warning underneath. She said that I needed to relax, that Dad's comment had been misunderstood, that people appreciated honesty, and that I had a tendency to make neutral moments into something dramatic when I felt overlooked. I asked her, calmly and without raising my voice, what exactly was neutral about being described as someone who was never meant to survive? And she exhaled softly, as if dealing with a child who refused to follow instructions. Then she told me it was metaphor, that it referred to the accident, to how fragile I had been, to how the family had endured a difficult period, and that if I insisted on interpreting everything as personal harm, I would continue to isolate myself. The words were familiar, structured the same way they always were, shifting meaning just enough to make my reaction seem unreasonable while leaving the original wound intact. I nodded as if I accepted her explanation. Not because I believed it, but because I understood that resistance at this stage would only escalate into a scene they could control, and I had learned that the most effective way to survive in my family was not to fight immediately, but to wait until the moment they were least prepared. Mom's shoulders relaxed slightly when I didn't push back, and she placed a hand briefly on my arm in a gesture that looked affectionate to anyone watching before moving away to greet another donor. I watched her go, noting how quickly she transitioned back into charm, how easily she rebuilt the image that had just been disturbed. Control in our family was always about timing. I stood up slowly, smoothing the fabric of my dress as I moved toward the side of the ballroom where the staff had set up a smaller bar, and I could feel eyes tracking me in subtle ways, curious but cautious, unsure whether what they had just witnessed required attention or dismissal. A man from the board, someone I recognized but had never spoken to directly, gave me a brief nod that held more acknowledgement than politeness, and I returned it without stopping, because even that small exchange told me something important. Not everyone was convinced. Not everyone would forget. Julian approached me before I reached the bar, his expression carefully arranged into concern that didn't quite reach his eyes, and he asked if I was okay in a tone that suggested he already knew the answer he wanted me to give. I told him I was fine, keeping my voice steady, and he shifted slightly closer, lowering his voice just enough to make the conversation feel private while still performing it for anyone within range. He said that Dad didn't mean it the way it sounded, that I knew how he was, that sometimes he used strong language to make a point, and that it would be better for everyone if I didn't take it personally tonight. Better for everyone, not better for me. I asked him, just as quietly, whether he believed what Dad had said, and for a fraction of a second, something unguarded passed through his expression before it disappeared behind that practiced calm. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he said that I had always been sensitive, that the accident had affected me in ways I still hadn't fully processed, and that maybe it was time to let go of the past instead of holding it against the family. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, that the program I worked on was doing well and that Dad had been proud to mention it tonight. Mention it, not credit it. I realized then that he wasn't just repeating the narrative. He believed it. The understanding settled into me with a clarity that didn't hurt the way it once would have, because at some point, pain had stopped being the most important part of this dynamic and had been replaced by something sharper, something more useful. Awareness. I saw, in that moment, exactly how the system had been built. How Mom softened the edges, how Dad defined the story, and how Julian stepped into whatever space they created without ever questioning whether it had been taken from someone else. It wasn't chaos. It was design, and I was the part they had decided could be removed without consequence. Julian reached out as if to touch my arm, perhaps to reinforce the performance of concern, but I stepped back just enough to break the gesture without making it obvious, and I told him I needed some air. He nodded, relieved, because that fit the version of me he was comfortable with. The one who withdrew instead of disrupting the structure that benefited him. As I walked toward the exit, I felt the recorder in my purse again, solid and present, and I realized that tonight had already shifted in a way they hadn't anticipated. They thought this was another moment I would absorb and carry quietly. They were wrong. The cold air outside the Halston Hotel struck my face with a clarity the ballroom had carefully filtered out. And as the noise of the gala dulled behind the glass doors, I felt something inside me settle into place with a precision I had never allowed before. For years, I had told myself that what happened in my family was complicated, that favoritism was emotional, that control was subtle, and that survival meant adapting quietly, without forcing truth into spaces that refused to hold it. But standing there with Dad's words still echoing in my mind, I understood something I had avoided naming because naming it would have required action. This wasn't misunderstanding. It was design. I took the recorder out of my purse and pressed play again, not because I needed to confirm what he said, but because I needed to hear how easily he said it, how natural it sounded to reduce my existence into a mistake in front of a room full of people who were supposed to respect him. The tone was steady, deliberate, almost rehearsed. And in that moment, I stopped hearing it as a passing comment and started hearing it as a belief he had carried for years, something he had simply been waiting for the right room to reveal. That shift changed everything. Because if it was belief, then it wasn't limited to tonight. It had been there long before. And if it had been there long before, then the accident was no longer just an accident. The thought landed with a weight that didn't panic me, because panic belonged to the version of me that still hoped for fairness, and that version of me was already slipping away. I remembered the break report I had never seen. The insurance file Dad handled personally. The way Mom shut down any conversation about that night with a tone that made questions feel inappropriate, and for the first time, those pieces didn't feel disconnected. They felt arranged. I didn't know yet what that meant in full, but I knew enough to understand that staying inside their control while asking those questions would be a mistake I couldn't afford. I called Dana, and this time I didn't hesitate or soften anything, because there was no version of this that could be made comfortable without losing the truth entirely. I told her what Dad had said, what I was starting to see, and what it meant if even a part of it was real. And she didn't interrupt, didn't try to calm me down, because she understood that this wasn't panic. It was alignment. When I finished, she told me I had two options. Stay where I was, and let them continue defining everything until even my memories belonged to them. Or step out completely and build something they couldn't reach. Then she said something that removed any illusion of delay. If you stay, you lose control. If you leave, you risk everything. I looked back at the ballroom through the glass. At the movement. The light. The version of my family that functioned perfectly as long as no one questioned the foundation beneath it, and I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of losing them. I was afraid of staying. So I made the decision without negotiating it in my head the way I always had before. I wasn't going back inside. I turned away from the entrance, heels clicking against the pavement as I walked past the line of parked cars and toward the darker edge of the street. And with each step, something that had been holding me in place for years loosened in a way that felt both terrifying and necessary. I didn't text Mom. I didn't explain to Julian. I didn't wait for the night to end or for a moment that felt more appropriate, because there was no version of this that would ever be approved by them. And that was exactly why it had to happen now. For the first time, I left without asking permission. As I reached the corner and the glow of the hotel faded behind me, I opened my phone, pulled up my email, and forwarded the recording to a private account Dana had helped me set up months ago for documentation, attaching a single line that I didn't overthink or rewrite. Evidence begins tonight. I didn't know yet how far this would go, how much it would cost, or what I would uncover once I started pulling at threads my family had spent years hiding. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. As I stepped into the quiet of the city beyond their reach, I was no longer part of their system, and I wasn't coming back. The first night without them did not feel like freedom. Not in the way people describe it when they talk about leaving something toxic behind. Because freedom in its raw form often arrives without comfort, without structure, and without anyone standing nearby to tell you that you made the right decision. I walked for nearly an hour before calling a rideshare, not because I didn't know where to go, but because I needed the distance, needed the physical separation from the version of my life that still existed behind those glass doors. When I finally reached my apartment on the north side, the hallway smelled faintly of detergent and old carpet, and the overhead light flickered once before stabilizing, as if even the building was reminding me that nothing here was curated or controlled. It was mine, but it was also uncertain. I didn't turn on the television or check my messages, because I knew what I would find if I did. A series of calls from Mom framed as concern, texts from Julian positioned as understanding, and eventually a message from Dad that would not ask a question but would state a version of events I was expected to accept. Instead, I sat at the small kitchen table with my laptop open, the recorder placed beside it like something far more significant than its size suggested, and I began organizing everything I knew. Dates, details, conversations, documents I could access, and most importantly, gaps, the places where information had been withheld or redirected in ways that had once seemed normal, but now stood out with uncomfortable clarity. Independence is not loud. It is methodical. The next morning arrived without ceremony, sunlight pushing through thin blinds and landing across the table where I had fallen asleep with my notes still open. And for a moment I allowed myself to feel the weight of what I had chosen. Not as regret, but as reality. I no longer had the safety net my parents had always implied existed, even if I had rarely used it. And I no longer had the illusion that I could step back into that world if things became too difficult. That door was closed, not because they would refuse me, but because I would not walk through it again under their terms. I stood, stretched the stiffness from my shoulders, and began the kind of day I had built for myself long before this moment. Structured, focused, and grounded in work that existed outside of them. At the clinic, nothing had changed on the surface, which was both a relief and a strange kind of disorientation, because it meant that the version of me I had built independently was still intact even as everything else shifted. I met with clients, reviewed case notes, and coordinated with the team on program updates, moving through each task with the same attention I always had. But underneath that routine, there was a new layer of awareness, a constant recalibration of what mattered and what no longer did. When Dana called me into her office between sessions, she didn't ask how I was in the way most people did, because she understood that the answer would not fit into a simple response. Instead, she asked what I had done since last night. I showed her. We sat across from each other as I walked her through the recording, the notes I had started, and the questions that had begun to take shape around the accident. And she listened without interrupting, occasionally asking for clarification, occasionally pointing out connections I had not yet fully considered. She reminded me that if I was going to pursue this, I needed to separate what I felt from what I could prove, because emotion, no matter how justified, would not hold under scrutiny the way documentation would. Then she outlined what the next steps could look like. Accessing maintenance records, insurance files, hospital documentation, and anything tied to the timeline of that night. All of it approached carefully, without alerting my family before I understood what I was dealing with. This was no longer about surviving them. It was about understanding them. The financial reality of that decision became clear within days, not as a sudden collapse, but as a gradual tightening of everything that had once been easier. Because while I had built my own life, there were still invisible threads tied to my family that I had not fully accounted for until they were pulled. A grant extension I had been expecting was suddenly delayed without explanation. A donor who had shown interest in expanding our program withdrew quietly, and a speaking engagement that would have provided both income and visibility was canceled with a brief email citing internal adjustments. None of it was directly connected to my parents in a way I could prove, but the pattern was too precise to ignore. Pressure doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it closes in. I adjusted quickly, not because it was easy, but because I had spent years learning how to operate without guarantees, taking on additional shifts, reducing expenses, and redirecting my focus toward areas that were less vulnerable to external influence. The apartment felt smaller as the days passed, not physically, but in the way space changes when it holds both your work and your uncertainty. And there were nights when the silence pressed in harder than I expected, not because I missed my family, but because I was finally confronting what life looked like without their shadow shaping every decision. Loneliness is different when it is chosen. But even in that isolation, something else began to grow. Something steadier than fear and more useful than anger. Because for the first time, every decision I made moved in one direction, forward, without needing to account for how it would be received by people who had never truly seen me. I began reaching out to contacts outside my family's network, building connections based on work rather than association, and slowly, carefully, opportunities started to reappear, smaller at first, but more solid, less dependent on influence, and more rooted in what I had actually built. At night, I returned to the files. I requested records where I could, followed leads where they existed, and documented everything. Not rushing, not forcing conclusions, but allowing the pattern to reveal itself piece by piece, because I knew that whatever truth was there had been buried intentionally, and uncovering it would require patience more than anything else. The recorder remained on my desk, not as a reminder of what had been said, but as proof that what I had heard was real, that the shift I felt was grounded in something concrete, and not just in years of accumulated pain. Weeks passed like this, structured, deliberate, and increasingly clear. And while the external pressure from my family's world did not disappear, it began to matter less as my own structure strengthened, because the more I built outside of them, the less their influence could reach me in the ways it once had. I was no longer reacting to them. I was moving independently of them. And for the first time, that felt like something stronger than survival. 3 months later, the contrast was no longer subtle, because the life I had built without them had begun to stand on its own, in ways that didn't rely on quiet endurance or borrowed credibility, and for the first time, people were speaking my name in rooms where no one had ever heard of the Mercer Foundation. The clinic expanded a pilot program I designed into a city-funded initiative, not because of who I was connected to, but because the outcomes were measurable, documented, and difficult to ignore. And when the data was presented to the council, it carried my signature, not Julian's interpretation of it. Invitations followed, first from small professional groups, then from larger organizations that cared less about legacy and more about results. And I accepted them carefully, choosing spaces where my work could stand without being filtered through someone else's narrative. It wasn't sudden success, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. Recognition, when it comes without manipulation, feels different. I moved into a slightly larger apartment on the west side. Not luxurious, but stable, with windows that let in enough light to make mornings feel like a beginning instead of a continuation. And I bought a proper desk instead of working from the kitchen table, setting the recorder in the top drawer not as a relic, but as a reminder of where the shift had started. My days became structured around growth instead of recovery, and while the work remained demanding, it no longer carried the invisible weight of proving something to people who had already decided who I was. Clients improved, programs expanded, And for the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge that what I had built was not temporary or fragile, but sustainable. But success, especially when it emerges outside a system built to contain you, has a way of attracting attention from the very people who once dismissed it. The first message came from Mom, written in the tone she used when she wanted to sound both proud and generous, as if she were extending something I should feel honored to receive. And she said she had been hearing wonderful things about my work, that the family was happy to see me doing well, and that perhaps it was time to reconnect now that things had settled. She didn't mention the gala. She didn't mention what Dad had said. She didn't mention the months of silence that followed my leaving. Instead, she framed it as a natural return, as if distance had been my decision alone and not a response to something they had created. I didn't reply. A week later, Julian called, and when I didn't answer, he left a voicemail that sounded almost sincere, saying he had seen my name in a report connected to the city initiative, that he was impressed, and that Dad had been talking about how proud he was of me, as if the past could be rewritten simply by ignoring it long enough. He suggested we meet for coffee. Just the two of us. No pressure, no expectations. Just a conversation between siblings who had been through a lot together. The phrasing was careful, designed to create shared history without acknowledging the imbalance within it. I deleted the message. Then Dad reached out. His email was concise, direct, and structured the way his communications always were when he intended to establish control without appearing aggressive. And he wrote that he had been informed of my recent professional developments, that the Mercer Foundation was entering a new phase of expansion in mental health services, and that there might be an opportunity for collaboration that would benefit both my program and the family's broader initiatives. He did not apologize. He did not reference the gala. He did not ask how I was. Instead, he presented it as strategy, as if what had happened between us was irrelevant compared to what could be gained by aligning again. That was when I understood something important. They hadn't changed. The context had. The success I had built without them was now something they could use, something that could be folded back into their narrative if I allowed it. And the silence they had maintained was not absence, but calculation, a decision to wait until I became valuable enough to reclaim. I sat at my desk, reading the email again, noticing the language, the assumptions, the way he positioned the opportunity as mutual when the structure of it clearly centered his foundation, and I felt none of the hesitation that would have existed before. There was no need to analyze what he meant. This wasn't reconciliation, it was acquisition. I closed the email without responding and opened the folder on my desktop where I had been storing everything related to the accident, the records I had managed to access, the inconsistencies I had begun to map out, and the questions that still needed answers. And I realized that the two paths I had been walking, building my own life and uncovering the truth behind theirs, were about to intersect in a way that would not remain private for much longer. Because if they were stepping back into my world now, it meant they believed they still controlled the outcome. They didn't know what I had, and they didn't know what I was preparing to do next. The invitation arrived 3 days later, formal enough to look like recognition and strategic enough to function as a summons, printed on Mercer Foundation letterhead, and followed by a personal email from Dad that framed the event as an opportunity for alignment rather than confrontation. The foundation was hosting a press conference to announce a major expansion into trauma recovery services, a partnership that would place them at the center of a national conversation they had spent years positioning themselves to lead, and my name was listed among the invited speakers. Not as a daughter, as a professional, as someone whose work had become too visible to ignore. They weren't reaching out privately anymore. They were bringing it into the open. I read the details carefully, noting the time, the venue, the list of attending media outlets, and the way my role was described. A contributing voice, a collaborator, someone whose work would be integrated into the Mercer model, language that softened ownership while quietly transferring control. Dad's follow-up email reinforced the tone, stating that it would be beneficial for everyone if I presented my program within the broader framework of the Foundation's mission, emphasizing unity, consistency, and shared vision. There was no acknowledgement of what had happened at the gala, no attempt to address the months of silence, only a forward-facing narrative that assumed compliance. They expected me to step back into position. Dana read the invitation with me, her expression calm but focused. And when she looked up, she didn't ask what I wanted to do, because she already knew this wasn't about preference anymore. It was about leverage. She asked instead what I had that could hold in that kind of room, not emotionally, but structurally, because if I was going to walk into a press conference organized by my father, surrounded by media he had likely already influenced, I needed more than truth. I needed proof that could survive exposure. I showed her everything. The maintenance request from the week before the accident, signed off earlier than the work order suggested. The insurance file with timestamps that didn't align with the official report. The internal email chain I had managed to access through an old contact, where Dad's office discussed containment strategy before the investigation had even concluded. None of it, on its own, was enough to prove intent. But together, it formed a pattern that was difficult to dismiss, especially when paired with the recording from the gala, his own words framing my survival as something that disrupted the family's trajectory. Dana didn't rush her response, because she understood that once this moved into the public space, it would not be something I could control in the same way I had controlled my exit. "You don't get a second attempt at this," she said finally, her voice steady but firm. "So if you do it in a way that leaves no room for reinterpretation." That was the line. No reinterpretation. I spent the next 48 hours preparing, not as a daughter returning to a family event, but as someone stepping into a space where narrative and truth were about to collide. And I built my approach the same way I built my work. Structured, deliberate, and anchored in what could be verified rather than what could be felt. I organized the documents into a timeline, cross-referenced details that reinforced each other, and rehearsed not what I would say, but how I would say it. Because delivery, in rooms like that, often mattered as much as content. The day of the press conference arrived with the kind of quiet clarity that comes before something irreversible, and as I stood outside the venue, a renovated civic hall that blended historic architecture with modern glass, I felt the same stillness I had felt the night of the gala, but this time it wasn't uncertainty. It was control. Inside, the room was already filling with reporters, cameras being adjusted, microphones tested, conversations layered with anticipation, and at the front, the Mercer Foundation banner stood behind a row of chairs where Dad, Mom, and Julian were already seated, composed, confident, ready to present a version of the future that did not include the truth I carried with me. When I entered, there was a subtle shift. Not dramatic, but noticeable. A few heads turning, a few cameras adjusting, because my presence here had not been expected in the way it had been planned. Dad saw me immediately. His expression did not change, not outwardly. But I recognized the micro-adjustment in his posture, the slight recalibration that meant he was reassessing variables, and for a moment, we held eye contact across the room. Not as father and daughter, but as two people who understood that something was about to happen that neither of us could fully contain. Mom smiled in that controlled, public way, gesturing for me to take the seat reserved at the end of the row, and Julian gave a small nod that suggested reassurance, as if this were still a situation he believed could be managed. They still thought this was theirs. The moderator introduced the event, outlining the foundation's expansion, the partnerships involved, and the significance of the initiative, and as Dad began speaking, moving through his prepared remarks with the same confidence he always carried, I listened not as someone reacting, but as someone waiting for the exact moment when the structure he had built would be most exposed. He spoke about family, about resilience, about the importance of truth in healing, and the irony of it settled over the room without anyone acknowledging it yet. Then he introduced me, not by name first, but by role, describing me as a contributor whose work had been supported and guided by the Mercer Foundation, positioning my achievements as extensions of his influence. And as the room turned toward me, cameras shifting, attention focusing, I stood slowly, feeling the weight of everything I had brought with me settle into something precise. This was the moment they had created, and this was the moment I was going to take. I stepped toward the microphone, not rushing, not hesitating, and as the room quieted, I looked directly at the reporters, then briefly at Dad, and finally back to the audience. grounding myself in the reality of what I was about to do. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today, I began, my voice steady, measured, exactly as I had prepared it to be. But before I discuss the program, there is something that needs to be addressed clearly and publicly, because without it, everything else presented here would be incomplete. The room shifted, subtly at first. Then I reached into my bag. I reached into my bag with a deliberate calm that slowed the room rather than breaking it. Because in spaces like this, control is often established not through force, but through timing. And every movement I made was intentional enough to make people pay attention before they even knew why. I placed the recorder on the podium beside the microphone, not as a dramatic gesture, but as something ordinary, something that belonged there, and that quiet normality drew more focus than anything louder would have. Then I looked back at the audience, letting the silence settle just long enough to hold them in place. And I said that what they were about to hear was not an interpretation, not a reaction, but a direct recording from the Mercer Foundation Gala, 3 months prior, captured in a room very much like this one. I pressed play. Dad's voice filled the hall. Clear, composed, unmistakable, carrying the same controlled tone he had used that night. And as the sentence unfolded, describing me as the daughter who was never meant to survive, the reaction in the room did not explode. It shifted. The kind of shift that moves through people when something aligns too precisely with what they had been told not to question. Some reporters leaned forward. Others stopped writing. A camera operator adjusted focus without realizing it, as if instinct had taken over where expectation failed. No one laughed this time. I stopped the recording before it could loop. Not because I needed to protect him, but because the impact had already landed. And anything beyond that would dilute what had just been established. Then I spoke again, keeping my tone consistent, because escalation would only make it easier for them to frame this as emotional rather than factual. And I said that statements like that do not exist in isolation, that they reflect belief, and that belief, when paired with control, often leaves evidence in the way decisions are made behind closed doors. I explained, briefly but clearly, that the accident years ago had been presented as mechanical failure, but that the documentation surrounding it did not fully support that narrative, and that I had spent the last several months reviewing records that raised serious questions about how that situation had been handled. I did not accuse. I outlined. Then I placed a printed timeline on the podium. Copies already distributed quietly to the front row before the event began. Each document labeled, dated, and cross-referenced, structured in a way that allowed anyone reviewing it to follow the sequence without needing my interpretation to guide them. Maintenance approvals that did not align with service completion, insurance filings submitted before certain inspections were finalized, internal communications discussing containment strategy before conclusions had been reached, all of it presented not as speculation, but as inconsistency. That was enough. The room no longer belonged to them. Dad stood before I finished speaking. Not abruptly, but with the kind of controlled urgency that suggested intervention rather than reaction, and he stepped toward the microphone with a composed expression that had carried him through decades of public scrutiny. He said that what I was presenting was a misunderstanding, that trauma can distort perception, and that while he understood my need to process the past, it was inappropriate to do so in a professional setting where the focus should remain on the Foundation's work. His tone was calm, measured, and designed to reframe the situation without directly engaging with the details I had presented. It was the same strategy, just larger. Mom followed quickly, her voice softer but no less deliberate, emphasizing concern, suggesting that I had always struggled after the accident, that the family had supported me through difficult years, and that this moment, while unfortunate, should be understood within that context. She reached for my arm as she spoke, not to comfort me, but to visually reinforce the narrative she was constructing, one where I was unstable, and they were patient. I stepped back before she could touch me. That small movement said more than anything else. Julian didn't speak at first, which was more revealing than if he had, because it showed that he was calculating, trying to determine whether aligning with them immediately or waiting would serve him better. And when he finally did step forward, he positioned himself carefully, acknowledging the documents, but suggesting that without full context, they could be misinterpreted. He didn't deny them. He diluted them. I watched all of it without interrupting, because this was the part I had prepared for, the attempt to pull everything back into a narrative they could manage, and when the moderator tried to redirect the conversation toward the program, I spoke again. Not louder, but with enough clarity to hold the room where it was. "I'm not here to negotiate my reality," I said, keeping my voice even, anchored. "And I'm not here to return to a structure that required me to disappear in order to function." The silence that followed was not confusion. It was recognition. I looked at Dad, then at Mom, then at Julian. Not with anger, not with hesitation, but with a steadiness that had taken years to build and only a moment to reveal. And I said that whatever happened next, whether they denied, reframed, or ignored what had been presented, it would not change the fact that I had stepped out of their control, that my work existed independently of their influence, and that I would not allow my name, my history, or my survival to be used as part of a narrative I did not choose. Then I stepped away from the podium. No permission. The room did not erupt the way people imagine when something collapses in public, because real power rarely shatters in a single moment. It fractures quietly as attention shifts and control slips from the hands that once held it without question. Reporters began speaking over one another, not loudly, but urgently, asking for clarification, requesting copies of the documents, directing questions toward Dad that no longer followed his prepared narrative. And for the first time since I could remember, I watched him without the automatic reflex to anticipate his response. He answered carefully, redirecting, reframing, invoking complexity where clarity had just been introduced. But the rhythm was different now, because the room was no longer listening the way it had before. Mom stayed composed, offering concern instead of confrontation, repeating variations of the same explanation that had always worked in private settings. But here, under lights and lenses, the tone that once softened everything began to feel rehearsed, rather than sincere. And I could see it in the subtle way people paused before accepting her words. Julian stepped back entirely, positioning himself at the edge of the stage, neither fully aligned nor fully separate. His silence now less strategic and more uncertain, because the structure he had relied on no longer felt stable enough to carry him without question. I didn't stay to watch it unravel. I stepped outside again, not as someone escaping, but as someone leaving a space that no longer required her presence to validate what had already been said. And the air felt different this time. Not sharper, not colder, but open in a way that didn't press against me. My phone vibrated almost immediately, messages beginning to arrive from numbers I didn't recognize. From colleagues, from reporters, from people who had never reached out before but were now paying attention, and I silenced it without reading them. Because this moment wasn't about reaction, it was about recognition. I had told the truth in a room designed to control it, and I had not been erased. In the days that followed, the narrative did what narratives always do when they are challenged publicly. It split, diverging into versions that competed for legitimacy, but the difference this time was that mine no longer depended on being believed to exist. The document circulated. The recording was referenced. And while Dad's foundation issued statements emphasizing misinterpretation and emotional context, the questions did not disappear, because they had been anchored in something tangible. Investigations were not announced immediately, but inquiries began. Quiet at first, then more structured, and the same systems my family had once used to protect their image now required them to respond within frameworks they did not fully control. Control, once questioned, is never as absolute again. I returned to my work without altering it to fit the attention that followed, because the life I had built did not need to be reshaped to accommodate what had happened. And in that consistency, something stronger than validation took hold. Clients still came in with their own histories, their own fractures, their own attempts to understand where they ended and where their families began. And I met them the same way I always had, grounded, present, and no longer carrying the unspoken weight of proving that I had survived something that should not have defined me in the first place. The recorder remained in my desk, but I no longer needed to touch it to remember what it represented. I had already used it. Mom wrote once more. A longer message this time. Not defensive, not apologetic, but reflective in a way that suggested she was trying to understand a version of me she had never needed to before, and I read it without urgency, without the instinct to respond immediately, because distance had changed the function of her words. They were no longer directives. They were simply communication. I didn't answer. Julian called twice, left no voicemail, and after the second attempt, he stopped, which told me more than anything he might have said, because it meant he was adjusting to a reality where access was no longer guaranteed. Dad never contacted me again. Not directly. And while his absence might have once felt like rejection, it now felt like acknowledgement, because silence, from someone like him, was rarely accidental. It was strategic, but it no longer reached me. Weeks turned into months, and the life I had stepped into continued to expand, not dramatically, not in a way that made headlines, but steadily, in ways that could not be undone by a single decision or controlled by a single person. And as that stability settled into something familiar, I found that the question I had carried for most of my life had quietly disappeared. I was no longer asking why I had been treated the way I was, no longer trying to trace the origin of something that had shaped me without my consent, because I didn't need that answer anymore. What I needed, I had already taken back. I no longer needed my family to define my worth.